My name is Renee Callahan. I'm 34 years old, and for 26 of those years, I was invisible in my own family. I want to start with the morning my mother called me sobbing, begging me to open my front door. But if I do that now, none of it will make sense. So let me back up. Let me tell you who I was before that morning, because you need to understand the years that built up to it. I grew up in a small town outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in a brick house with green shutters that my father was always meaning to repaint and never did. There were 2 kids in that house, me, and my younger brother, Dean. Dean was 2 years behind me, and from the moment he could walk, he was the son our entire family orbited around. I don't say that with exaggeration. I say it because it's simply what happened, the way weather happens, the way seasons change without anyone voting on it. My father, Walter Callahan, worked at a manufacturing plant for 31 years. He wasn't a cruel man. I want to be fair about that because this isn't a story about monsters. He was tired, mostly. Tired from work, tired from bills, tired in that quiet way men of his generation carried without ever naming it. My mother, Linda, worked part-time at a dental office and ran the house like it was her second full-time job. She loved us. I believe that. But love, in our house, was not distributed evenly, and I spent most of my childhood doing the math on that inequality without anyone ever admitting there was math to do. Dean was charming. He was funny in the easy way that made teachers laugh instead of write him up. He was good at baseball, good enough that my father spent every Saturday of my childhood at a diamond somewhere, cheering. I used to sit in the bleachers with a book, because nobody thought to ask if I wanted to be there, and nobody noticed that I didn't. I was the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who got good grades without anyone attending a single award ceremony, because good grades from me were expected, not celebrated. When I brought home a report card with 5 A's, my mother would glance at it and say, "That's wonderful, honey," already halfway to the stove. When Dean brought home a C+ in a class he'd been failing, my father took him out for ice cream to celebrate the improvement. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for a sad little girl. I'm telling you because it explains everything that came after. It explains why, at 22, I moved 4 hours away to Pittsburgh the week after I graduated college, and why I built a life that had almost nothing to do with the house with the green shutters. I became a physical therapist. I specialize in post-surgical rehabilitation, mostly knees and hips, and I built a small private practice with a business partner named Angela Reyes over the course of 8 years. It wasn't glamorous. It was steady. It was mine. Nobody handed it to me, and nobody in my family ever asked a single question about how I built it. Dean, meanwhile, floated. He started 3 different business ventures in his 20s, a food truck, a marketing consultancy, a fitness app, and all 3 failed within 18 months. Each time my parents helped him, not with advice, with money, real money. The food truck alone cost them almost $40,000, money that came, I would later learn, out of their retirement savings. I never asked for anything. I want to be clear about that because when people hear stories like mine, they sometimes assume the overlooked child was also demanding and got denied, and that's why there's resentment. That wasn't it. I never asked because I learned early that asking led nowhere good. I built my life quietly, and I visited home for holidays, and I smiled through dinners where Dean's failed food truck was discussed with more warmth than my entire career. The moment that changed things, the real hinge point, happened 4 years ago, when my grandmother, my father's mother, a sharp, funny woman named Dorothy who was, frankly, the only person in that family who ever really saw me, passed away and left behind a modest inheritance. Not a fortune. About $180,000, split evenly on paper between my father and his sister. My father's portion, 70% of it, went to Dean, not to pay off debt, not into savings, into a down payment on a house, and into seed money for Dean's 4th business venture, a boutique gym that would also fail within 2 years. I found out about this by accident at a Thanksgiving dinner when my mother mentioned it casually, the way you'd mention what she'd bought at the grocery store. "We were able to help Dean get into that house because of Grandma Dorothy's money," she said, passing the mashed potatoes. I remember setting my fork down very carefully. I remember asking, In a voice I kept impressively level, what had happened to the rest of it, my rest? The portion that in any fair accounting should have touched my life at some point, even symbolically. My father looked at me the way you'd look at someone asking an inappropriate question at a funeral. "Renee, you don't need help," he said. "You've always been fine on your own." I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, because it took me years to understand what he actually meant by it. He meant it as a compliment. In his mind, he was praising my independence. What he didn't understand, what he never understood, was that "you don't need help" had been the sentence used to justify every single act of neglect I'd absorbed since childhood. My competence had become the excuse for my exclusion. I didn't make a scene that Thanksgiving. I finished dinner, I hugged my mother goodbye, and I drove the 4 hours back to Pittsburgh with tears running down my face the entire way, the kind of crying you do specifically because no one is there to see it. After that, I pulled back, not dramatically. I didn't announce anything. I simply stopped calling every Sunday and started calling once a month. I stopped driving home for every holiday and started alternating, then skipping. My mother would occasionally text, asking if everything was okay, and I would say yes. Work is just busy, which was true, but also wasn't the truth at all. Over those 4 years, my practice grew. Angela and I opened a second location. I started dating a man named Marcus Webb, a structural engineer I'd met through a mutual friend, kind and steady in a way that felt almost unfamiliar to me, because I had grown up believing steady men saved their steadiness for other people's sons. Marcus was the first person who ever asked me, genuinely, what I wanted for my birthday, and then remembered the answer. Dean, during those same 4 years, went through his boutique gym failure, then a brief and painful divorce from his wife, Kayla, who left him after discovering he'd taken out a second mortgage on their house without telling her, to fund yet another venture. This one, a cryptocurrency trading scheme that evaporated almost overnight. My parents, I later learned, had co-signed on some of that debt. I heard about all of this in fragments during my monthly calls with my mother, who always framed Dean's collapses as bad luck rather than patterns. "He's just going through a rough patch," she'd say, every single time, for 6 years running, until the phrase had lost all meaning, the way any word does when you repeat it past the point of truth. I'll be honest with you. There was a small, ugly part of me that felt something like vindication watching Dean's life come apart while mine steadily improved. I'm not proud of that feeling, but I promised myself I would tell you this story honestly. And honesty means admitting that betrayal doesn't just wound you, it changes you, sometimes into someone who watches their brothers suffering with something less than pure sympathy. Then, 8 months ago, my father had a heart attack. It wasn't fatal, but it was serious enough that he spent 9 days in the hospital and came out with a diagnosis that meant early retirement, immediately, no negotiation. And that was the moment the numbers my family had been avoiding for years finally came due. Because here's what I learned slowly over the months that followed. My parents had almost nothing left. Between Dean's failed ventures, the money from Grandma Dorothy, the co-signed loans, and years of quietly bailing him out in ways I hadn't even known about, my parents' retirement savings were essentially gone. My father's pension from the plant covered basic bills. That was it. No cushion, no safety net, nothing. My mother called me in March, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, and told me they were thinking about selling the house. The house with the green shutters. The house I'd grown up feeling invisible in, which somehow still managed to be the only home I'd ever truly known, in that complicated way homes are. I asked carefully if Dean knew, if Dean was helping. There was a long pause on the phone. Then my mother said, "Dean has his own problems right now, honey. We don't want to burden him." I actually laughed. Not a cruel laugh, a genuine, startled laugh, the kind that escapes you when the universe finally says the quiet part out loud. 26 years of not wanting to burden Dean. 26 years of me apparently being burden-proof, need-proof, exempt from protection because I had built myself into someone who didn't require it. I told my mother I needed to think, and I hung up, and I sat in my car in my own driveway for 45 minutes before I could make myself go inside. That night, I told Marcus everything. All of it, the full history, things I'd never said out loud in one continuous telling before. He listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of gift, and when I finished, he asked me one question that I couldn't answer that night. What do you actually want to happen here? I didn't know. I still don't think I fully knew, even weeks later when the next call came. That call came from Dean. I hadn't spoken to my brother directly in almost a year. We exchanged birthday texts, nothing more. So when his name lit up my phone on a Tuesday evening in April, I felt my stomach drop before I even answered. "Renee," he said, and his voice had a rawness to it I didn't recognize. "I need to talk to you about Mom and Dad." I sat down at my kitchen table. "Okay." "They're going to lose the house, Renee. Actually lose it. The bank's already sent letters." He paused. "I was thinking, I know things have been weird between us, but I was thinking maybe we could split helping them. 50-50. You've obviously done well for yourself, and I don't have anything left to give right now." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, looking at my reflection faintly in the dark kitchen window, and something in me went very still and very clear, the way water goes when sediment finally settles. "Dean," I said, "do you have any idea how much of Grandma Dorothy's money went to you?" "That's not fair. That was years ago." "Do you know how much?" Silence. $126,000, Dean. That's what I found out at Thanksgiving 4 years ago, sitting at that table, finding out by accident that Mom and Dad had given you almost the entire inheritance while I got nothing. Not because I didn't need it, because nobody thought to ask. I didn't ask for all of it. But you took all of it. My voice was steady, steadier than I expected. And now you want me to split 50-50 on cleaning up a mess that mostly exists because of choices you made and money you were given. Money I never saw a dollar of. Dean was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, not into apology, but into something more defensive, more wounded. "So what? You're just going to let them lose their house to prove a point?" And that question, that specific question, framed exactly like that, like my hesitation was cruelty, and his decade of financial recklessness was simply bad luck. That was the moment something in me finally, fully closed. "I need to think about this," I told him, and I hung up before he could answer. I didn't call my parents that week. I didn't call Dean either. I sat with the question for days, turning it over, trying to separate what I actually felt from what 26 years of training told me I was supposed to feel. And then, on a Sunday morning in early May, I heard a knock on my front door. It was 7:15 in the morning. Marcus was still asleep. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and felt my entire chest go cold. It was both of them. My mother and my father, standing on my porch in Pittsburgh, 4 hours from home, with two suitcases I stood there for a behind moment them with my hand steps. on the deadbolt, not turning it, just looking through the peephole at my parents, standing on my porch like strangers waiting to be let into a life they'd never bothered to visit before. My mother had aged in a way I hadn't fully registered on our phone calls. Her shoulders rounded forward, her coat too big for her, like she'd shrunk inside it over the past year. My father stood slightly behind her, one hand resting on the porch railing like he needed it to stay upright, and I remembered, with a jolt, that this was a man who'd had a heart attack 8 months earlier and had driven 4 hours anyway. I opened the door. "Renee," my mother's voice cracked on the single syllable of my name. "I'm so sorry to just show up like this. We didn't know what else to do." Behind me, I heard Marcus's footsteps on the stairs, and then his hand settled quietly on my shoulder, not saying anything, just letting me know he was there. "Come in," I said, because whatever else was true, I wasn't going to leave two people in their 60s standing on a porch in the cold. Whatever I was working through, cruelty wasn't going to be the vehicle for it. I made coffee while they sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat weeks earlier turning Dean's phone call over in my mind. Marcus made a quiet exit to give us privacy, squeezing my hand on his way out, and then it was just the three of us, in a kitchen 4 hours from the house with the green shutters, finally having the conversation that should have happened years ago. "The bank sent a foreclosure notice," my father said, and his voice had none of the authority I remembered from my childhood. It was just tired, just afraid. "We have 60 days. "Dean told me some of it," I said carefully. My mother's eyes flicked up. "He said you two talked." "We talked." There was a long silence. My mother wrapped both hands around her coffee mug like she needed the warmth of it to keep speaking. "Renee, I know we haven't always." She stopped, started again. "I know things haven't been equal between you and your brother. I've known it for a long time. I told myself it was because you didn't need the same kind of help he did. I told myself that was fair." "Was it?" I asked, not sharply, just honestly. My mother's face crumpled, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched my mother cry in front of me without trying to hide it or explain it away. "No," she said. "It wasn't fair. It was never fair. You were the easy one, and we treated easy like it meant unnecessary. We treated your strength like it meant you didn't need us, when the truth is you needed us just as much. You just never made us feel guilty enough to notice." I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first crack of something that had been sealed shut for a very long time. My father cleared his throat. He'd always been a man of few words, and what came next clearly cost him something to say. "I gave Dean money I should have saved for retirement because watching him fail felt like watching myself fail, and I couldn't stand it. Watching you succeed never scared me the same way, so I never thought you needed watching." He looked down at his hands. "That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. It's just the truth, and you deserve the truth, even 4 years too late." I sat there for a long moment, letting that settle. Then I asked the question I actually needed answered. "What do you want from me? Right now, this morning? What did you drive 4 hours for?" My mother and father exchanged a look, and my mother said, quietly, "We don't know, honestly. We didn't come here with a plan. Dean told us you were angry, and rightfully so, and we didn't want the next conversation we had with you to be over the phone about a house that's already gone. We wanted to see you. Actually see you. Something we should have done 100 times over the years and didn't." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because this isn't a story about a perfect, clean forgiveness. I felt love, old and complicated and never fully extinguished. I felt anger, sharp and still very much alive. And I felt something else, something I hadn't expected. A kind of relief, because for the first time in 26 years, my parents were finally seeing me as someone whose feelings required their effort, rather than someone whose competence excused them from making any. I didn't decide anything that morning. I told them they could stay in my guest room for a few days, that we'd figure out next steps together, and that I needed time before I made any decisions about money. My father, to his credit, didn't push. "That's fair," he said. "That's more than fair." Over the following 2 weeks, something in our family began, slowly and imperfectly, to reorganize itself. I called Dean again, and this time the conversation was different, because I'd had time to think about Marcus's question. What did I actually want to happen? I didn't want to punish my parents for the rest of their lives. I didn't particularly want to punish Dean either, though I won't pretend the idea hadn't crossed my mind more than once. What I wanted was for the truth to finally be spoken out loud, in the open, where everyone could see it clearly, instead of buried under decades of careful avoidance. "I'll help with the house," I told Dean. "But not 50-50. Here's why, and I want you to actually listen instead of getting defensive." I laid it out for him, the inheritance, the co-signed loans, the pattern that had repeated itself for over a decade, while I'd been quietly building a life with zero financial support from anyone. I told him I would contribute what I could, a real, meaningful amount, enough to stop the foreclosure and buy our parents breathing room. But I told him he needed to contribute in a different currency. Honesty, accountability, and an actual plan for how he intended to stop the cycle rather than simply surviving this crisis, and repeating the pattern in 3 years with a 5th business venture. Dean was quiet for a long time on the phone. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the defensiveness from our earlier call. "I've been so scared," he admitted, "that if I actually looked at how badly I'd messed up, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. It was easier to keep starting new things than to sit still and count the damage." It wasn't a full reckoning. People don't transform in a single phone call. But it was the first honest thing my brother had said to me in years, and I let myself believe it mattered. Over the next month, a plan came together. I contributed a significant sum toward stopping the foreclosure, not out of guilt, and not out of some need to prove I was the better sibling, but because I genuinely didn't want to watch my parents lose the only home they'd ever had, green shutters and all. Dean, for his part, sold his car, took a steady salaried job at a friend's logistics company instead of chasing another venture, and started making regular payments toward the co-signed debts that were still his responsibility. My parents, meanwhile, met with a financial counselor, something I insisted on, and began the slow work of restructuring what remained of their finances around my father's pension and modest savings. None of it was a fairy tale. My father still occasionally reverted to old habits, asking Dean how his job was going with a warmth he still sometimes forgot to extend to me, and I still occasionally felt that old flare of invisibility rise up in my chest at holiday dinners. Old patterns don't dissolve overnight, no matter how honest the conversations that expose them. But something had genuinely changed. My mother started calling me every week, not to check whether I was fine because I was always fine. That had never been the problem, but to ask what was happening in my actual life. She asked about my practice. She asked about Marcus. She asked, for the first time I could remember, what I wanted, rather than assuming she already knew because I'd never caused trouble by wanting anything. 6 months after that Sunday morning knock on my door, my parents came to Pittsburgh again, this time by invitation, this time with advance notice, this time for Marcus's and my engagement dinner. My father stood up during dessert, and in front of Marcus's family and my closest friends, he said something I will remember for the rest of my life. I spent most of my daughter's childhood believing that the children who don't ask for help don't need it, he said, his voice unsteady but clear. I was wrong. Renee built an entire life on her own, with no help from us, and instead of being proud of that the way I should have been every single day, I let it become an excuse to look the other way. I'm sorry it took nearly losing everything for me to finally see what I should have seen all along. I love my daughter, and I am so proud of the woman she became, in spite of us, not because of us. I cried at my own engagement dinner, in front of everyone, and for once I didn't feel embarrassed about needing to be seen crying. Dean, for his part, has stayed steady for over a year now, the longest stretch of stability I've ever witnessed from him. He still calls me sometimes, awkwardly, trying to build the kind of sibling relationship we never really had growing up, two people raised in the same house who somehow grew up almost as strangers. We're not close, not yet, maybe not ever in the way people imagine when they picture siblings. But we're honest with each other now, and honesty was something we'd never had before, so I consider it real progress. My parents' house still has the green shutters. My father finally repainted them last spring, the same faded green, because my mother said she didn't want them to look like a different house. I understood what she meant. Some things you don't want to erase, even the imperfect ones, because they're still the shape of where you came from. I think often about that morning on my porch, my parents standing there with their suitcases, finally showing up at my door instead of waiting for me to show up at theirs. For 26 years, I was the daughter who never needed watching, the daughter whose strength was mistaken for a lack of need. It took my family nearly losing everything to learn that strength and need aren't opposites, that the quiet ones, the reliable ones, the ones who never ask, are so often carrying the heaviest weight precisely because no one ever offered to help carry it. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. Don't wait for the strong people in your life to break before you notice they were carrying something heavy all along. Ask them. Actually ask them, and actually listen to the answer, before the knock on the door comes too late for anyone to answer it the right way.